right, I'd like to welcome everybody to our event this evening, our teach-in here on climate change. My name is Philip White. I'm a doctoral student here in history, and I'm very excited to welcome you to our interdisciplinary panel. And as you can tell, this teach-in has a bit of a peculiar title, The Good News on Climate Change. I don't know the last time anybody heard a title like that. But essentially what we would like to convey with this title and the solutions that we're going to be talking about tonight is that climate change is an enormous problem, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. And there is no shortage of creativity that we can employ to address the problems that it poses. And so what I'd also like to suggest is that we have the technology to solve this problem, and what we need to focus on is the social and the political will. And I hope to hear a little bit about that tonight. So I'd also like to let you guys know if you have any questions, this is going to be a very open and hopefully dynamic panel. But if you have any questions, also feel free to email us or send us a tweet. And then hopefully I can seamlessly integrate those questions into the panel as we go along here. And it might be a bit less disruptive, but if you don't have that technological access, don't feel like you can't ask questions. The last 20 minutes or so will be devoted to open questions and hopefully a great dialogue from the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. Sabine von Mehren, down at the end there, holds a PhD in German Studies from the University of California, Davis. Born in Germany, she grew up on a small island in the North Sea, which is increasingly imperiled by the rising seas of climate change. She learned from the history of Nazi Germany that silence in the face of great adversity, like climate change, is nothing less than complicity. She believes we have a great responsibility to take action. At Brandeis, she teaches German language, literature, and culture, and directs the Center for German and European Studies. Next semester, she will be teaching Human Nature, European Perspectives on Climate Change. Our next speaker is Frank Lowenstein, who worked as a conservation biologist for nonprofit environmental groups since 1990. And before that worked as a science journalist. Before coming to Brandeis, he taught graduate-level field courses at the University of Vermont in conservation biology at Bard College at Simmons Rock. He served as the global leader for climate adaptation for the Nature Conservancy until 2013, and is currently both a senior fellow in President Obama's Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas and deputy director of the New England Forestry Foundation. Next semester, he is teaching Environmental Studies 108, Land Conservation in a Crowded World. Our next wonderful speaker this evening is Judy Hertzfeld, who spent a career crossing between conventional disciplines, from chemistry to physics and biology, and from the sciences to science-related public policy. She received her PhD in chemical physics from MIT, her Master's of Public Policy from the Kennedy School of Government, and is a fellow at the Massachusetts Academy of Sciences, the American Physical Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Charlie C. Chester teaches global environmental politics here at Brandeis and at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And is co-editor of the 2012 volume Climate and Conservation, Landscape and Seascape Science, Planning and Action. Next semester, he is teaching Environmental Science 107B, Atmospheric Civics and Diplomacy, World Politics of Air Pollution, Ozone Depletion, and Climate Change. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. John Ballantyne, who protested the Vietnam War during his formative years as an undergraduate. He broadened his perspective after graduating by working for an oil company, and during the oil crisis of the 1970s, studied energy politics and policy at the University of Chicago. For him, energy, climate, and politics has to be approached as a complex system that is hard to predict and full of uncertainties. Next semester, he is teaching a graduate seminar, Finance 235A, Investing in Energy, Fossil Fuels to Cleaner Energy. And our last, but certainly not least, speaker this evening is Eric Olson, who teaches at the Heller School and is an expert in scientific literacy, invasive species, and sustainable international development. He received his PhD in evolutionary biology and ecology from Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, and works to both enjoy the world through learning and teaching, as well as improving it through energy and climate activism. And without further ado, I'd actually like to open up this panel this evening with a bit of a loose question just to get things going. So I'd like our panelists to please talk about a recent movie that they particularly enjoyed. In no particular order.
You want me to start? Well, the last movie I saw was Boyhood at Waltham Embassy. It was awesome. I would love to see it again. And the next movie I'm going to see that everyone talked about yesterday is Citizen 4, about Edward Snowden, which apparently is amazing. So I haven't seen it, but
well, the last movie I saw is not nearly as good a movie as Boyhood, but I enjoyed it, and that's Galaxy Quest, which is a parody of the Star Trek series. And in light of climate change, I think it's particularly fitting that the captain's slogan from Galaxy Quest is "Never surrender, never give up," which is probably exactly what we need for dealing with climate change.
So the one that comes to my mind is one that my husband and I sat through twice, which is extraordinarily unusual for us. Once with the comments off and straight up, and once with the comments on. And it has to do with never giving up also, but in a different way. And it's not a new movie. It's Temple Grandin. It was a made-for-TV movie, and it impressed us enormously.
Well, Friday night, I got to see a movie at Kendall called The Diplomat. And it's about the saving of Paris at the end of World War II as the Americans are approaching Paris. And Hitler had directed his general there, I think Choltitz was the name of the general, and he was instructed to blow up Paris. We would have no Louvre, no Eiffel Tower. Most of the buildings would have been completely gone, but a Swedish diplomat came in and convinced him that he shouldn't do it. And I think the lesson from that movie is that crises can be averted through good diplomacy.
John, can I get you to use the mic?
Yeah, I'm a film noir fan. So A Most Wanted Man, which is the latest movie made of Le Carre novel, which, of course, if you've seen that, has an unhappy ending, and it reminded me of A Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which was my vision of Berlin, which is Richard Burton not making it out of Berlin before the wall fell. But Le Carre has a very complicated vision of the world where good and evil kind of fighting each other, and sometimes good does not win.
Right, so my last film was Guardians of the Galaxy. Awesome. I went to see that with my 24-year-old daughter, who is in India a lot of the time, so it was great to be with her. And we both downloaded the mixtape the next day. So. How about you?
I actually just saw A Most Wanted Man the other night, and it was fantastic. So I'm going to have to agree with Dr. Ballantine here. So without further ado, now that we're done with the polite introductions, I'm hoping the panel can speak a bit to why climate change is so urgent to each of you. You're all coming from different disciplines here, or you have different expertise. And I'm wondering if there's a specific lens or framework that you believe is powerful to understanding the immediacy of climate change. I'd say that we can go in order if you want, but I
don't want to be the first.
Welcome this to be kind of an open conversation, so please keep your comments rather short and direct, and everybody will get a chance to speak.
Yes, it is on. So, is this working?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I have worked in the field of conservation since possibly before 1990, but professionally since 1990. And in the course of that, I've gotten to spend some time in some amazing parts of the world. And the signs of climate change are very visible in many natural systems. And so I first became interested in the issue through that lens. And I first wrote about that in the 1980s in terms of sea level rise and climate change impacts on barrier beaches. As I've gotten more in depth in climate change, I've realized that in my view, climate change is not particularly a threat to the natural world, which is what I originally thought and what I was originally motivated to get informed about it by, but rather a threat to civilization and to society as we know it. The natural world may experience a mass extinction, as Betsy Colbert's new book articulates quite well, but it will still be there, and over millions of years it will recover. But our civilization has evolved and has built its structures and built its framework in the very limited 10,000 to 15,000 years of climate stability that we have experienced recently. And we are not, as a civilization, at all prepared for what's coming.
So, from the sort of an old science point of view, I'm probably the oldest person on this panel, I believe. So the way I think about it is the way Paul Ehrlich sort of presented to us about 50 years ago now, the population biologists in general, which is that species grow until they're self-limiting in the sense they either run out of resources or they drown in waste, one or the other. And he warned that we were on a trajectory to do something like other organisms do. And the question at the time was, what is going to be limiting? What's the thing that's going to hit us first? And there were arguments between him and other people about resources, and the economists said, oh, resources are substitutable and things like that. And there was relatively less attention to the waste side. And ultimately, what climate change is about, to the extent it's about CO2, is waste, and it's gaseous. It's the least visible of our waste, except to scientific instruments and so forth. And so it's something that was foreshadowed, so to speak, predicted a long time ago. It has a huge acceleration factor built into it, and that's, to my mind, the whole picture becomes clear, and the acceleration factor gives it the urgency.
All right. Well, I've been thinking about climate change for a long time now, and I still can't get my head around it. When the question was asked about what kind of lens would you put on it, I think you have to look at climate change first and foremost through your personal view, and that comes in both your head and your heart. And I'd say your view from your heart might be a little harder because you can't fact check it. You can fact check your head. I would say that the view from my head is, Frank, I would very interested in your perspective. I do worry about the natural world. I spend a lot of time in my career in Yellowstone National Park looking at what Yellowstone is protecting. And I think for me, one of the most fundamental challenges I have in my professional career is, what is Yellowstone going to look like in 50 years? It's probably going to look very different than it looks today. And what in the world are we trying to protect today in that case? And that's a really hard question that I have not, I've written a book about it now, or edited a book about it, and I still have not figured out the answer to that question. I've got ideas. So that's from the head. From the heart, we talked about movies. I'll just mention a book I just read. It's an okay book. It's called The Bone Clocks by a guy named David Mitchell. He wrote a well-known book, turned into a movie with Tom Hanks called The Cloud Atlas. And there's a last chapter of this book that is a dystopic end of the universe scenario because of climate change. And it's extremely well written and extremely frightening, and one of these things that really got to me. And it got to me because, and I guess this gets back to it, it's not the natural world that my heart goes out to, it's what my kids are going to face in what they're going to face 25 years down the line. Is it going to be that? And I'm concerned about that kind of dystopic future. So that's my
I guess I look at climate change and sort of the challenges of the environment partly through the perspective of businesses and companies, both in the United States and throughout the world. And I think you have to look at that very differently. In the United States, energy companies have been in opposition to government intervention since Standard Oil was broken up with the help of Teddy Roosevelt. And that's been a long-standing position of most of the energy companies, and you just have to read any of their statements. They also have tremendous capacity and capability to deliver low-cost energy, which, yes, it has an externality called carbon in it, but nonetheless they can do that. And all of us enjoy low-cost energy in this country, and you're going to see a lot of people objecting about electricity prices going up in New England this winter. So that is an issue I look at, and then you look at the differences in Northern Europe and the energy companies there, particularly Shell, in changing their perspective on how they looked at energy and to what extent they'd invest in greener technologies. But they'd only invest if they make money. Nonetheless, the energy companies in Northern Europe do accept climate change. They do put it into their models, looking at that, and wonder to what extent you can get a European policy that is consistent with the rest of the world. And then just kind of shifting broadly to more command economies, and my friends who are on the IPCC say the good thing about being in Beijing is that a lot of people are dying because of the air quality, which means people have to do something about the coal and the particulate issues in the air. And China has the capacity to make a change and decide to do it. They're not doing it now, but it does have the capacity, and so does Russia. So to a certain extent, command economies can change, and if you look at sort of what's happening over the next 30 or 40 years, that is where, to the extent that the future of the planet depends, it depends on those parts of the world that are different from the West. That doesn't make it easy, but that's some of the conversations Obama and Putin should be having right now, since they're in Beijing.
So I guess I would say that I take, well, I should say that in addition to a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, I have a bachelor's degree in geology. And for my senior thesis, I studied paleoecology, looking at the way geologists interpret past environments. And I now teach a course at the Heller School of Climate Change, and one of my roles in the course is to talk about what we learned by looking at the past, how climates change in natural systems. And first off, I'd just like to say that this has been a wonderful discipline to delve into. Paleoclimatology is just a fascinating bit of detective work. Perhaps later in the panel we could talk a little bit about some of the basic principles. It's like a paragraph or two that we could go over on the basic principles of how climates change naturally and why we're now so convinced that no natural cause can account for the changes we're seeing today. I think it's important to clear that up. But in addition, what's that? Well, but first I just want to say why I'm so concerned, because what we found by looking at that is that the Earth is really a rather remarkable, complex system of ices, of greenhouse gases, and of 2-mile deep seas on average covering our planet. And those of you who've had a bit of chemistry and physics know that water has a very high specific heat. 90% of the anthropogenic warming since 1950 has been absorbed by the oceans. It's almost amazing that we can detect a surface change at all. And so we're poking at a very powerful dragon when we disrupt these heat balances. And there's a lot of uncertainty in this business. So I guess I'm worried about not the sort of, core predictions of the IPCC, but I think there's some things out there on the long tail that are really scary. And it just doesn't seem very wise to keep going in this way. The average predicted sea level rise, according to the National Academy of Sciences, the expectation is 1 to 4 feet by 2100. But these predictions have proven pretty consistently conservative. And so, that it just doesn't seem like a sensible thing anymore to poke this dragon. And that's why I guess it keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I think it is a social justice issue for me, and that is something that really bothers me. I had a slide, let's see if I can find it here, that shows who put the stuff out there, right? And as you can see, because industrialization started in Europe, the Europeans are really most responsible for the mess we're in. And so even though I'm very proud of Germany for its revolution in renewables and of the action the European Union is taking, they better be the leaders in this, because they were the leaders in messing it up, right? And I find this graph particularly helpful because people are always very quick to point to China as the bad guy. China is growing its emissions when we should all be reducing our emissions. But as you can see in this graph very clearly, there is a reason why countries outside of the Western industrialized world want to see the Western world pony up a big chunk of the cost of cleaning up the mess, because they made the mess in the first place. And I was pleased again to see there is a Green Climate Fund that the UN put together, or that it's a pledge drive that the UN has put together to come up with the money that especially developing and underdeveloped countries will need, so that they can leapfrog the industrial age and go into the renewable age right away. Well, Germany and France both pledged $1 billion to that fund, which is great. President Obama had the opportunity to pledge something at the climate summit in New York, but just waffled. Denmark has pledged, Switzerland has pledged, so I'm hoping the U.S. will pledge as well.
Absolutely. Well, maybe this is a good time. You brought up Germany. So my next question to you all is, I'm hoping that you can point to an example of a potential solution that you see, something inspiring at home or around the world. This is International Education Week. That inspires you, or that points to an example of something that we should be doing more of. And I don't know, Sabine, if you'd like to start?
Yeah, since I'm praising Germany. That's so rare at Brandeis that I can praise Germany. Let me say a few things, and I'll show you a brief clip. So what has Germany done? Why is everyone talking about them? Well, first of all, they've raised awareness about climate change for a long time. And they were inspired, by the way, by American environmentalists. It's not like they invented the conversation. The conversation was really invented here, but they took it very seriously, and I believe in part because that young generation in the 60s and 70s really felt if there is something looming over our head and we all know it and we're not doing anything about it, we're responsible, we're complicit, right? They learned that lesson from the history of the country. So they started with a law promoting sustainable energy sources in 1991 that sort of got things going. And they imposed stricter building codes for efficiency, stricter retrofit requirements. And in 2000, under the red-green government, they imposed a new energy law, renewable energy law, that has since gone through several new iterations to get basically what they call Energiewende, to follow the Wende that unified the country again in 1990 with the Wende, the change, the transition to renewables. And that meant to give a fixed price to anyone who was generating renewable energy and promise them that it would be bought by the grid, to give tax credits for new installations, to give cheap loans, and unfortunately, to give exceptions to industry so that they wouldn't be burdened by too high a cost, which has caused some trouble with the coal industry in recent years. But it does, it shows that it was successful. Renewable energy generation has dramatically increased in the last 10, 15 years. And Germany is now, according to the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, the #1 efficient country in the world. That doesn't surprise anyone, right? These Germans, they're so efficient. And they have debates, they had debates about climate change, but nothing like what's happening in our country here. And one of the positive consequences of this development is the remunicipalization and recommunalization of electricity grids, or local power as they call it, which means that the profits now support public services and actually create more jobs than the fossil fuel industry. And I want to show you 1-minute clip from the movie Disruption, which advertised the climate march, the People's Climate March in New York, because I was so excited to see them say nice things about Germany. Okay, it was there, now it's not. Let's see if it works. It doesn't work. Yeah, no, sorry.
What you got there?
I will shut up after this. No. It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? It worked before.
Maybe somebody else could talk for a few minutes while you get it to work.
Isn't it open in the other tab?
You think it is open and that's why?
Crowdsourcing to undergraduates is always the best way.
No, it's
It's
not.
up on the
Okay, I'll play around. This is my calendar. I'll play around with it.
So this tab here.
You guys are smart. Yes. Woo!
It takes
Awesome.
a long time to switch energy sources, 50, 60 years to go
Can you
from
make it
wood
full
to coal to oil and gas. We lack 50, 60 years.
The reason we want to get off of fossil fuels now is because we have to protect our way of life.
We need a vision for what the post-carbon economy looks like that is inspiring enough and delivers enough in terms of jobs, in terms of new opportunities, in terms of better health. It has to be exciting.
There are many more jobs available to people who are going to be building wind turbines, retrofitting houses so that they waste less energy.
Solar panels have to be installed by a person. That person has to go to your home. There's no way to outsource putting that solar panel onto a roof.
A 100% renewable economy is within our grasp. It's economically and technologically possible. It's not something that we need to keep researching because it's always off in the distance. No, it's here. It's a question of political will. If you look at the renewable revolution that's happened in Germany, it wasn't about leaving the renewable sector to the market. It was about creating different incentives. And there was an explosion of innovation and creativity.
Germany is now the #1 solar country in the world, even though they have the same amount of solar incidents as Alaska.
Can we do it? Can we take the power that has been highly centralized, highly focused, controlled by very few hands, and it is not an accident that very few hands controlling power in the sense of electricity leads to very few hands controlling power in the sense of political power. We are going to try a global experiment that is going to be the most difficult thing human beings have ever done, which is to rip those two apart, which means we are democratizing power in both senses of the word.
Democratizing power, that's the key here. We're democratizing power in the best sense of the word. And I just wanted to quickly show you what that looks like. So now 47% of the renewable energy installed in Germany is in the hands of citizens, of individual people and cooperatives in the country. So they are completely in charge, and it's actually sort of a wave where cities buy the electricity grid back from corporations, which just started with some kids who thought that it would be a good idea, and everyone said, "What? That's crazy!" And then they made it happen. Here's a town that was declared energy independent today. Entirely powered by renewable sources, a town 80 kilometers south of Berlin. Tiny little town that now produces energy for a wide area. This is what my island, the view from my island in the North Sea looks like when you look to the mainland. It's a beautiful view as opposed to here where people always think they have to file lawsuits against it. This is solar near Freiburg. This also today, opened today, offshore wind park, Meer Wind Süd, which is a giant wind park that's right here in the North Sea. Here's Denmark, here's northern Germany. This is the island I grew up on, and this is Helgoland. And they have 80 wind turbines producing up to 288 megawatts possibly of power. And starting today. So it works.
So just to echo that, I think one of the most interesting scientific articles that I've read in the last 5 years is the Williams et al. Article from 2012 published in Science that evaluated California's law, which is the toughest in the country, that requires an 80% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions below 1990 levels by 2050. And it's much more stringent than any of the other laws that sort of have that same aspiration, including the one we have here in Massachusetts, that it's much more, the enforcement mechanisms that are built into the law are much more stringent. And they said, well, they put together a blue ribbon panel to evaluate, can we do it? And what would it mean? And the fascinating things about it are, A, they said, yeah, absolutely we can do it. B, they said it wouldn't cost that much. It would reduce the growth in the GDP of California between now and 2050 by 1.3% was their estimate. So not the current GDP, but the growth of it would be reduced by 1.3% in real terms. And they've also said the key thing is electrification. You can still drive a car. You don't have to change your lifestyle. They say it can be done with minimal changes in lifestyle. Nobody has to become a vegetarian who doesn't want to. Nobody has to move to the city who doesn't want to. But you have to, if you're going to drive your car and be stuck in LA traffic all day, it has to be an electric car. The interesting thing about that is in terms of Sabina's point about the breaking apart of the grid, they looked at that too. And they said, well, you could do it through renewables. You could do the degree of electrification that's needed through renewables. You could do it through nuclear, or you could keep your existing infrastructure and add carbon capture and storage to it, and the cost is pretty much the same all three ways, or you could do a mix of the three. So I want to highlight that the solutions, not only are they demonstrated to be possible in Germany, they're also scientifically evaluated to be possible. And this idea that there's a political element, that we need to address the power of industry, although I personally agree with that, it's important to recognize that that's not a function of the need to move to renewable energy. You can move to zero carbon emissions with a society that's equally derives the benefit of corporations and derives the consequences of corporations as we do today.
So, I wanted to say two kinds of things. One bounces a little bit off the comments about Germany and Europe, and go back to my first impressions about constraints on the planet, before we can identify exactly what they were so clearly. Which is that if we have our carbon footprint, for example, and double our population, so carbon footprint per person and double our population, we've accomplished absolutely nothing. And so one of the things about Europe is that they are no longer growing their population. And there are issues that keep showing up in the newspapers about, oh my God, it's a demographic catastrophe. There are ways of dealing with that, some of which also show up in the newspaper, including some immigration, things like that. But it's really not optional, because eventually you do have to level off. So that's there's a model in Europe for that as well. The other thing that gives me heart is, as I was coming up, so in my career, the funding of science, besides outside the military, was academic science in particular, very heavily dominated by NIH. It reflects the wish of all of us to live forever and have a good quality of life, and in particular of our senators and congressmen to live forever and have a good quality of life. And so NIH has been relatively generously funded, say, compare, for example, to the National Science Foundation. And I keep thinking that someday people are going to wake up and realize that our health depends more on our environment after a certain point than it does on the next pill. And I kept wondering why it's taking so long, and what's heartening is in recent years I feel like it's coming. I see my younger colleagues really trying to do materials chemistry research related to energy catalyst research related to green chemistry and conserving energy. And I'm very heartened by that. Battery materials.
I guess I have to, I'm going to bring up the other side of the coin of what we have to do in response to climate change. We've been talking about mitigation. We also have to adapt. And there's going to be a very large range of adaptation methodologies for human adaptation. And I wrote it down just because you've all heard it before, but Fitzgerald's quote, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. We have to be able to mitigate the effects of the causes of climate change at the same time that we think about adapting to it. When it comes to the natural world and how the natural world is going to adapt, the approach that really needs to be taken is large landscape conservation. So I mentioned that I worked in Yellowstone National Park. Well, Yellowstone's going to be a very different place in 50 years. But probably, if we can keep the landscape from Yellowstone going all the way north up to the Yukon, we can allow plants, animals, everything there to survive in the long term. And so it's initiatives like one I've been involved in called the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative that I think is the kind of approach that is going to be necessary. And those types of approaches, these large landscape approaches, are now going global. And there's lots of different initiatives, everything from the Australian Alps to Atherton in Australia, the Terai Arc in northern India and southern Nepal. These things are global, and they don't get a lot of attention, but I think that's where we need to pay attention for protecting the natural world.
Could you switch to my slides, do the Middle East, Iran, and the West? Because I want to go back to our 1943 meeting of Stalin.
Is this it? No, this is
No, that's me.
someone else. Sorry.
Didn't you add them to your slides?
Oh, yeah, of course, I added it to
Because I want to talk about political change, because I look at this through a political lens. If you go on, just scroll down to, not to there. Okay. 1943, Hitler made a big mistake. He attacked Russia, or Soviet Union. And at that point, as you may know in your history, Soviet Union and Hitler were not aligned. And so Stalin changed, and the meeting that took place in Iran in 1943, in December 1943, was the then Allies dividing up Europe post-war and also planning an Eastern Front attack. So that's Tehran, 1943. Important to remember, and remember the Middle East has already been divided up after the Ottoman Empire fell after World War II, after World War I, among the Western interests. So looking at the Middle East, you have to think about that as the lowest cost source of energy in the world. And you may not like it, but that's the way it is, and that means the gas and the oil. Then Mossadegh. We applaud him as a hero. Time puts him Man of the Year in 51. Then the Anglo-Persians, British Petroleum, decide they don't really like the fact that he's going to nationalize and represent the interest of Iran.
Will you say a little bit more about who he was?
Mossadegh was a democratically elected, seen by people in the West as possibly being communist-leaning or sympathizers. And in 53, we with MI5, MI6 helped engineer the coup. And then the Shah came in, and as then you know, we had to wait till 78, 79. So for the revolution, which we're now living with in Iran. But so as you look at that, the map of the Middle East is really important, and I want you to realize that allies change all the time. And of course, right now, as you know, there are the nuclear negotiations going on with Russia, maybe cooperating, maybe not, in the background. So that's one part. Now the next slide shows you, so just thinking about the Middle East, and the Middle East can change. And if you look at the map, you want to look at the map of where Iran is in the Middle East and its relationship to Saudi. Here is sort of and I tend to be more pessimistic about what's going to happen, but there are possibilities for change. And here you can see that our growth throughout the world has been basically, as we talked about, has been fueled first by coal. Coal is incredibly efficient from a BTU perspective. It's dirty, but it can generate a great deal of energy, and oil can too. So as fossil fuels, and this is one of the challenges as you look at technology, other than fission and fusion, getting energy from other sources costs more on a BTU basis. And so this is the projections done, is this BP or IEA? Yeah, it's BP. Sort of saying, as you look at the world and the continued growth of energy usage, yes, there's going to be renewables. Yes, there's going to be hydro and things like that, but still we're a carbon fuel-based economy worldwide. Now that can change and shift. And so the next thing is, go down 2 slides. 3, I guess. Yeah. Here is looking at what you can do in terms of energy sources to reduce the CO2 content and keep the temperatures rising from less than 3 degrees centigrade, which is going to take a tremendous amount of effort. As you know, the target's 2 degrees centigrade. Most scientists do not believe that's possible, and so, given what's happening now. And so you're going to have huge technology changes to make that happen, and political changes. One of them may be batteries. And we should be putting basic research into batteries rather than trying to fund them through ventures. And right now you've got this venture form kind of process of trying to fund it. It's still basic research. When you can get a battery that can store for 12, 15 hours, suddenly the grid becomes enormously efficient. You can use the wind and solar. Right now we don't have that, and so that's a major problem. I talk to my physicist friends. They're all excited about fission. And these are physicists, and they're thinking about that. And if you get fission coming on, fission. Oh, just good old nuclear. Just good old nuclear, not fusion. Not just building an old, plant with cement. So you get a lot of people playing around, which you want them to be doing, looking at different forms of energy that can transform so that by 2050, 2060, you can have a switch. Because if you don't get out of that fossil fuel trap, and you're in deep trouble, and you have to have people understand and recognize that. And as I said, again, the scientist friends that I talk to, a lot of them are quite optimistic about the Chinese scientists understanding this and trying to build more efficient coal plants. They have much more efficient coal plants than we do here, switching to gas, which has less CO2, and that can reduce the trajectory a little bit, not enough, but a little bit. And that's what you need to have. And there will be a surprise. We don't know what that's going to be. It can be, disastrous, and it can be, positive.
All right. Well, there's so many threads here that I'd like to follow up on. I don't know where to start. But I'll just start by saying that today in the New York Times, we can see you Germany and raise you Denmark.
Yes.
Because Denmark has just announced...
They're small.
They're going...
Right, 4 million people.
Right, but they are a fossil fuel-based economy like all the other economies in the world, and now they're switching. and they're going to 100% renewable by 2050. Oh my gosh. So they're at 40% renewable on their electric grid right now, and aiming for 50% by 2020. And they want
This is a
to.
competition.
No, it's great.
Yeah,
They want to electrify all their transportation as well, and this would require improvements. This is the great thing about this case, is that they're not saying we're there yet in terms of all the technologies, but they're going to just drive as fast as they can towards that goal, no pun intended, and assume that the cars will be ready by the time they want to make that switch. And so it's a courageous and very somewhat ambitious goal to commit themselves as a nation in this direction. At the same time, I totally agree with John that this is a daunting challenge. And one of the, as a part of this Sustainable International Development Master's Degree Program, I'm acutely aware of the fact that 30% of the world's population has no electricity at all. It's an astounding figure. And 40% still cooks on dung or wood. And so to bring the benefits of this amazing electricity and other fuels that we have is a huge goal. I think it's going to be hard to do without some more investment in fossil fuels in some of those countries. There has to be some mix. I'm afraid that the World Bank and other lending organizations are already under pressure not to lend money to countries that are in desperate need of some kind of central power generation. It's hard to match the power of coal, oil, and natural gas still with renewables. And so it feels to me like, in addition, we now know that there are emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture. As you add nitrogen fertilizers to soils, you produce one of the most powerful greenhouse gases, which is NO3. And so nitrous oxide, sorry, my chemist will probably correct me. But the point is that we need to make some room in the global commons for the people who we need to bring up behind us in this.
So they're positive development solutions.
Yeah, so the positive developments. Well, I think, this example of Denmark is really exciting. How about in the United States? There's increasing academic research on this question. And if we could go to my slide, Sabina. Okay, go all the way to the bottom. Yeah, the fourth one from above. Yeah, that one. So this is an amazing study, and this guy, Jacobson, is starting to travel the country. He's not, some sort of wacko. He's in the engineering department at Stanford. And he and his team just asked the question, what would it take to build a renewable energy infrastructure by 2030, or he says, come on, by the latest at 2050, to power New York State? It just asks this question. They took New York State, they took all the power consumption, including buildings, heating and cooling, and homes, and cars and trucks, trains, subways, everything. Aviation, it's hard to run a jet on electricity. But anyway, they did, and so they examined the feasibility of this, and they found some pretty startling things. One is, go to the next slide, you need very little storage. And this has been duplicated now in a study centered on Ohio, this grid centered on Ohio, westward to Illinois, eastward to New Jersey, southward to North Carolina. There's one kind of big operating grid in that region of the country. And another team of people looked at the possibility, what would it take to, by installing solar and wind mainly, what would be the result? How would you run the grid during peak demand times. And what they found was you didn't need storage. You didn't need batteries. The answer is redundancy. You have to build, and this is just going to be part of our future world, I'm convinced, you have to build up to 3 times as many energy gathering devices as you would need if the wind and the sun were constant. And what this allows you to do is somewhere in the state of New York and somewhere in that region around Ohio, there's wind blowing. And if you have 1/3 of the wind collecting devices in that region, allowing the powering of all the rest of that region, then you have the redundancy you need. In other words, what we're going to be doing in the future, instead of building to meet demand, we'll build to meet resource, if you see what I mean. And the consequence was really quite striking. Because the wind is so much stronger in the winter, it turns out that by building to meet summer demand, you have enough energy left over to heat the houses. And so these are 2013. These studies are coming out, and the map is interesting. It shows you the amount of area that you have to cover. The yellow says solar photovoltaic and concentrating solar power. And that means that over the state of New York, you would have to disperse across the state an area that size, that yellow blob, with solar collecting devices. Plus, the blue one just above it, onshore wind, you'd have to disperse across the state of New York an area equivalent to that blue blob. Rooftop solar, you would have to disperse across the state an area that would sum to that red blob. And then the big one is offshore. And this is true for Massachusetts, too. I recently received a slide from the head of the Department of Public Utilities for Massachusetts. And it's astounding what we have offshore Massachusetts. And so it's twice as expensive, but it's twice as expensive as the current fuel sources. Although I would say that those prices have come down dramatically in the recent 2 decades. Spectacular declines in both wind and solar. And the other point is, it's expensive only if you don't take into account the externalities of climate change. And if you go back to the top of my slide now, all the way to the top, this is really exciting. I think this is exciting because we're beginning to realize just how dangerous fossil fuels continue to be. Now let me just preface by saying fossil fuels are a miracle. I think that a time will come when we look back on them not with such fear and loathing, but with real appreciation, as they were appreciated when they were first discovered. They were viewed as life-changing, and they did. We have whales today because we don't burn whale oil. It's just a spectacular invention. The fossil fuels are truly astounding miracles. They've given us our modern world. But we've discovered some things about health. Look at this. Now, that's Beijing in a month ago. And those people are going to live less lives, shorter lives. We now know that experience of walking daily in that air kills people. It shortens your life. And we can put $1 on that, or if you want. And that study by Jacobson I showed you a minute ago did that. And he showed that by a complete end of combustion in New York State, if you value a human life at the current rate that courts do, we would pay for that change in 17 years. Now, what if it's off by 50%? Okay, so we pay for it in 25 years. The point is that in health benefits alone, we really should be moving in this direction, regardless of what you think about climate change. Next slide. In March, the World Health Organization reported that 7 million people die each year, 1 in 8 total global deaths as a result of air pollution. Next. It isn't just developing countries. Do you see that red bar? 33 million people in the United States still live in counties where the particulate matter of 2.5 microns or less is exceeding the EPA limit. These particles are so tiny, they cross your alveoli in your lungs, and your blood becomes dirty. What about to a pregnant woman? What impact does that have? Next. Right, one thing is, we'll see that in a second, but look at the 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005. The amount of particulate matter has come down in the last few decades, but it's not changing much now. It seems to have stabilized. Next. So this is September of this year. For every 10 micrograms per cubic meter of these particulate matter of 2.5 microns in Massachusetts, the baby's birth weight dropped almost an ounce, and the chance of premature birth increased 6%. So we're still living in a dirty country, in spite of all the advances we've made in air pollution control. And so on health benefits alone, I just want to say that co-benefit piece is really, really exciting to me. So very promising.
Perfect transition. I really want to bring us back to Brandeis, because that's in the title, and we're all here, and we all want to know, what can we do about this? And I think there's three big questions I want to ask here in the next 40 minutes before we open up the conversation to the audience. But the first one I want to pose is that Brandeis is an institution founded on the virtue and the principle of social justice. Is climate change a social justice issue? And if so, why?
Yes.
Yes. So
Next question.
Tell us
I'm
why.
going to be short. I already said it's a social justice issue because the people who are suffering most from the consequences are the ones who are least responsible for it. And if Brandeis takes its social justice mission seriously, then it must become a leader in fighting climate change. And that includes, in my personal view, that we must divest our endowment from fossil fuels.
I'll add to the why. There was a study that just came out last month in the journal Nature Climate Change that looked at the potential allocation of the remaining carbon emissions if we want to have a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. And basically, if you allocate emissions on a per capita basis and say every single person on the planet has the same right to pollute the air as every other person. In other words, we take whatever available externality there is and divide it evenly across everybody. Then the United States and Europe are already in deficit. We need to stop emitting anything yesterday. If you allocate it based on historic emissions, then we have a little bit longer, but it's still measured in less than 2 decades. So, I have something to say about Brandeis Solutions, but is this the time to say it?
Why don't we say it? Next question. So that was a good...
Okay.
I don't want to disagree with anything that was said about social justice in international terms, but for me, social justice also extends across generations. And especially at an institution that's dedicated to preparing people, young people, for the future, I think that that's especially important.
At the international level, the principle of equity has an acronym, and it's an ugly acronym, but it's a worthy acronym of everyone knowing. The acronym is CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. And so that's, as we head towards Paris, a year and plus from now, a year and a couple weeks from now, when you read about climate change in the New York Times and they're talking about equity between countries, that is the acronym, Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, that they're going to be debating. That is in the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And essentially it is the developed world saying, we don't really believe in this principle even though we signed this document, and the developing world saying, we are not going to do anything until you sincerely recognize this principle. So that's where the debate's going to be at an international level.
Yes, but I go back to that picture I showed you in Tehran in 1943. The world's much more complicated, and I say to my students, would you go work for an energy company, a public utility, and work with the engineers to come up with solutions? Would you sit down and make an alliance with Stalin, who was just a little worse than Hitler, and defeat him and win World War II? And I think that is the way, as we look at Brandeis, how do we engage in the world, which is very complex? How do we engage with other universities as they look at climate and energy and contribute to that? And Robert Stavins has written a lot about this at the Kennedy School, and his blog is out there. People at the Yale disagree with him. So there's a lot of debate about this issue of the role of universities in promoting research, in promoting dialogue and education, and trying to get the people who fund us, these corporations that we invest in and are part of endowment, to change their behavior in what they're doing. And that also means that you go out and work for energy companies, work for public utilities, because they have tremendous resources and capacity to change and move that curve down. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's possible.
So again, with meeting Bangladeshi students and students from Nigeria and places elsewhere on the world, I've become aware of the terrible unfairness of this. Bangladesh produces 0.3% of the emissions, and yet 160 million people in Bangladesh live in areas threatened by sea level rise. And not just through direct flooding, but also through effects of their aquifers. Most of the drinking water for the Bangladeshi population is from groundwater. Sea levels rise, we have saltwater intrusion into the aquifers. So we're talking very short time frame, really. For by 2100, up to 3 or 4 feet of sea level rise would result in just a disaster for this. Nigeria, the one I just recently became aware of, 32 million Nigerians live on the coastlines in the Niger Delta. And so, it just seems like a terrible unfairness to inflict on these folks that have not caused the problem, this kind of displacement.
Which I think brings us back to Brandeis and what we can do here. And we also have a question that I think dovetails well into this. And this comes from Elise in the audience, and she asks, how do we deal with the political challenge of this election and the possibility of the 2016 election? And what I take that to mean in the next question that we're going to deal with is, what can Brandeis do about this today? Is that I think it's not unfair of me to say that we, in our own country, are confronted with, just political intransigence on this issue, and which makes action at the local and the state level even more important, and the campus level. And so if you guys would talk about specifically what can Brandeis do, Dr. Ballantine has thrown down the gauntlet for us about how, there's another question involved in this. What should the relationship be between universities and the companies that are extracting these resources that we both need and need to get off of?
So first of all, I've taught this fall and last spring Life on a Changing Planet, and I have been blessed with having fantastic students both times. And one of the things I teach is techniques of environmental problem solving, and in the course of that we use brainwriting, we use this thing called the analytic hierarchy process, and we read the underlying literature about why we might use those. And what does that produce? That produces a way to tap the creativity of the students. And there are pages and pages of ideas that my students have generated about what Brandeis could do about climate change. And they are great ideas, fantastic ideas. I'm happy to share. The thing about that then is, well, so how do those ideas fall out? How do we think about those ideas? And I think that they fall into things Brandeis could do as an institution that of several thousand people that uses a lot of electricity to do things like run projectors and heat buildings and cool buildings and keep students happy in the wintertime and clear streets and bring people to campus and get people off of campus and all that stuff. So there's things we could do about our actual energy use. There's things we could do to speak to what Charlie said about adaptation, to reduce vulnerability to disruption. Think about the October snowstorm in 2011. Think about the summer of 2012 when Long Island Sound got so hot that the Millstone nuclear power plant that powers 40% of Connecticut's electricity had to shut down because Long Island Sound exceeded the design specs for the reactor. And that's pretty intense. So this redundancy that Eric spoke to in energy systems is not only going to be needed if we do renewables, we're going to need it anyway because of the increased vulnerability to disruption and extremes of weather that is going to affect our existing built infrastructure. So there's an adaptation piece. Then there's Brandeis as an educational institution. Speaking to what John spoke to, how do we prepare students to be solution finders in the world to come? How do we prepare students to be the best, most effective climate change analysts, climate change responders, climate change scientists, physicists, engineers, etc., which the world's going to need. And there's probably some things that they're going to need in response to climate change that involve greater creativity, greater tools for accessing their own creativity and that of others for collaboration across cultures and disciplines, all kinds of things that would affect how we teach. And finally, there's Brandeis as a political actor that Sabina spoke to. The issue of divestment is one potential approach to Brandeis as a political actor, calling attention to the importance of the climate change debate, and as Judy has spoken to in some of our previous conversations, the impact of the climate denial movement as an anti-science, anti-intellectual movement, and the obligation of the university to respond to that, which I found very powerful. Thank you, Judy. So, those are sort of four categories of actions that Brandeis could think about taking. And I think those aren't mine. Those come from my students. Some of my students are here in the room. I don't know if you guys want to stick your hands up from this year and last year. Maybe you should stick yours up too. I think there's a lot we could do here, and I think the creativity of the student body is something we should be tapping into.
I just want to quickly second that and say one of the reasons we created this panel and got together was actually that we wanted to show you that it can be done, that we wanted the students to know that all you have to do is start. We've been meeting as a group of faculty, and Gordy and others have been part of it, and we will continue to meet. We will meet with the provost. The new provost has already accepted an invitation to meet with us. I think one thing that as a university we can model for students is that you don't need a large organization. You don't need to be discouraged by the enormity of the problem that we're facing. You should feel encouraged, and that's why we chose the good news for our title, because a lot can be done. There are a lot of people on this campus who are very passionate about this issue, and many people who probably are, but they don't dare to acknowledge it. And so I would highly encourage you to speak to people, be obnoxious about climate change at any possible moment, every dinner conversation, over Thanksgiving, with your parents, with the neighbors, with anyone you can think of. Ask them what they believe, because I think the biggest threat we're facing is the silence that is so deafening, and it is threatening, and we need to overcome that and move towards action.
I wanted to just make a little comment about this question about divestment. There's so many different ways to look at it, and there is a point of view enunciated by the president of an institution down the river. that we shouldn't use an endowment for political ends. And to a certain extent, I agree with that because there's no end, there's no, obvious boundary to anything like that. But this business that we just mentioned about, we have this on our seal, truth into its innermost parts. When you go into fact denial to a point that puts civilization at jeopardy, that's just a whole different category from just about anything else that I've been involved in politically over my career. And if it's not divestment, at least shareholder responsibility to push these corporations. And that when we don't do that, we're denying a part of who we claim to be as a university. And I think that's very important. Now, there's also the question about fiduciary responsibility, but it seems to me that actually, considering all that's going on, it could be highly risky to stay invested in fossil fuels, because if people do start taking, if and when, hopefully when, people start taking seriously that 80% of what's been discovered in the ground needs to stay there, that investment's going to look like a really bad deal. So, and other people on this panel know better than I do that there's been some analyses that one could do as well for the endowment with other investments and avoiding fossil fuel, which won't change, that by itself won't change the companies, but it sets a statement and makes us more consistent with who we say we are.
Going back to the question of what we do on campus about the upcoming, over the next couple of years, going up to the next election. Coming from a family of Republicans who are socially liberal, fiscally conservative, who watch Fox News and listen, are skeptical of Fox News, but also are skeptical of the claims of climate change. There's a lot of reasonableness out there that is very skeptical of climate change. And while I think Sabine's called towards obnoxiousness, we all understand what that is. You also have to be careful that you don't become a sounding box that's just essentially white noise. And you have to listen to people who don't agree with you. You have to remember that some of the greatest environmental successes that the international community has achieved have been under Republican administrations. In conservative administrations, our world would be a horrible place to live if it wasn't for what the Reagan administration did.
And Nixon before that.
And Nixon before that. Yeah. So you have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I want to sort of echo that point, and again, sort of coming from the 60s when there was SDS and occupation of buildings, and having, been at Harvard and of course Columbia occupied the first building. The radicalism of language can put people off. And I think one of the issues that at least I have, that Hansen has gotten, who's at James Hansen, he's at
NASA, formerly at NASA.
Formerly at NASA, has gotten quite shrill. And he basically led the awareness of climate change back in the 80s, but he's gotten, as understandably, upset as he's looked at the evidence and I think his latest book was sort of Letter to My Grandchildren. And being shrill is not necessarily the best way to engage people in an educational conversation. Bill Muma, who is one of the, at least our colleagues over at Tufts and one of the IPCC scientists, works very carefully in presenting the evidence in clear ways, not hysterical, working hard on the language of how do you communicate. The American Psychological Association did a big review on what's the language to communicate about climate and how to do it and how to engage people. Yale has done a lot of work on this, so it's important to look at how you engage people. Back to sort of my frame of reference in the 60s. The Ivy colleges may have revolted and been against the war, but that was not when it was really effective, is when it was across the campuses throughout the country, when there were protests at Kent State and other places were not the liberal areas, that was really critical, and where there are those conversations taking place at the dining room table and with people in companies and corporations around the world, in the United States, saying what's going on in Vietnam, why are we there? And there was a process of, I would say, nonviolent, respectful engagement. Yes, there were protests. And so I think this is a really important issue of how do you talk about these issues. And we see a lot of shrillness on both sides. And that's, I think, what's hard, because then people stop listening when you get preached at. It's hard to listen when somebody's just preaching at you. And I mean, I use Bill Muma as sort of my model, is that he's worked very hard to figure out how do you communicate what's going on in climate, and how do you get people to sort of understand those issues and respond to them. What Brandeis should do, at least in my perspective on this, and you know, Eric knows this, I think we should be thinking about our overall carbon footprint and looking at how do we measure both our portfolio and performance, how do we measure, how do we acting in our lives here, how do we behave, and we as an institution can say, we're responsible people, we want to be engaged in the world and find ways to do this that makes sense, that reduces our carbon footprint and how we're here, that we pull the curtains, and that we have fewer lights on, and all those sort of things. We aren't using plastic containers, and we do all those sort of things, find ways to drive less. You know, we can go on that whole list, and there are ways and measure our carbon footprint, and we also ask our portfolio, our investments, to start measuring and thinking about that. But if you want to call it socially responsible, you want to call it some other broader index. Harvard is starting to do that and looking at their endowment and trying to find other measures to do that, and you can start engaging, you know, other universities in thinking about this in a broader sense rather than vilifying. But that's my perspective.
So I in defense of Hanson, just briefly, I just remembered a quote by George Bernard Shaw: "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." Why has the divestment movement taken fire? I think it's not simply fear of climate change and a concern that our political leaders aren't going fast enough. I think, for me, my desire to call out these fossil fuel companies in some way, in some manner, and maybe it is through shareholder action. I think if that's what our choice is, we have to become much, much, much more aggressive in that. But one of the problems with shareholder action, by the way, that I've learned on this divestment committee, is that we don't own much in the way of actual direct stock. And we own mutual funds. And those managers are the ones that actually buy and sell the stocks. And you can't do shareholder investment through that shell. It's sort of like a force field around the companies, and you can't get underneath it. You have to own the stocks outright. So influencing these directly is very challenging in the way we manage our endowment. But the reason I think that this has taken such fire is that there has been in this country, more than anywhere else in the world, an active, rather a creative group. And I don't want to sound like, you know, some sort of conspiracy theorist, but these are the data, right? There was a study done of these climate change counter movement organizations. And this is by a guy who's a professor at Drexel. And he just obtained information on the financial resources of 91 climate change counter organizations funded by 140 foundations. And it turns out these are annually funded by $900 million from who knows where. It's increasingly difficult to find out. Now, at one time, ExxonMobil was actually one of the contributors to these organizations. But they pulled out under public pressure. So, you know, that was shareholder investment action. They haven't gone back and said, we're sorry for that. And I think that in a sense, you know, the damage has been done.
that according to this study, 43% of Americans recently replied no to the question, do scientists believe that Earth is getting warmer because of human activity? 43% of Americans replied no, and another 12% said they don't know. This is unprecedented across modern industrial economies, and so I feel like this deliberate effort to discombobulate, to create befuddlement and confusion, to mine the IPCC reports for the slightest error and then amplify them up through blogs. And I'm convinced some people are actually paid to eagle eye the newspaper for reports about climate and then immediately send off a reply, a comment, letter to the editor that is dismissive and confusing and so on. So, this campaign, we've seen it in tobacco, we've seen it in what? Apartheid to some extent, but this campaign to confuse people and drag out and to, cloud the science and even call into question the motivations of the scientists and their characters and mine their emails, that email scandal where emails were illegally stolen and then sifted through for the slightest hint of collusion. It's disgraceful. And it makes anyone who looks at that data really angry. And it should make you angry. And these companies have funded it. So that's why when I do sometimes feel like, even Brandeis with its... We would have a very hard time divesting. I've seen that. Now that I've seen, the inner workings of how our endowment is invested. It is not an easy matter, and it would lead to more risk.
We'll just get one comment here from Judy, and we'll go on to the next question.
Really quick about the shrill thing, and I'm so glad you quoted Shaw, because it reminds me of when my parents were concerned about my involvement in anti-war activities during the Vietnam War when I was in graduate school. And I remember thinking very clearly that I was very grateful that there were some real extreme people out there, so that what I was doing, which was definitively anti-war, seemed very calm and reasonable by comparison. And so I think what I'm trying to say is I think there's a place for a lot of different approaches, and the shrill ones may get some attention, and then we can say, well, okay, let's just talk. And in that context, it becomes possible to seem reasonable. When without that, those people, we might seem like the shrill ones. So just briefly.
Yeah.
Can I just make super brief?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just in response to Eric's comment about the difficulty of divesting, and I think it was Charlie's comment about measuring our carbon footprint, it's becoming easier and easier to do every day. Bloomberg Financials in New York now monitors and rates every single stock that they give you a rating of for its carbon footprint. The Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, same sort of thing. TrueCost, a company that's trying to make money by doing exactly this sort of thing. So the market is recognizing an opportunity, and people are stepping into it and selling data that will enable people like Brandeis or people like you and me in our own personal lives to make choices about our investments.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one other thing that I'd say about that's really interesting on this financial front is that a bunch of insurance companies and reinsurers are beginning to understand the risks of this. And there was a letter that just went out this month or last month that asked the presidents and some of the people on these boards of the big fossil fuel companies that said, what is your liability if you have been funding the disinformation campaigns on climate change that you personally might be responsible? And so I think it's interesting that a lot of environmentalists or leftists have dismissed the market. I mean, there's plenty of problems with neoliberalism, I think we can all agree, but markets are incredible forces. And I think we might rediscover their power and how to make those markets more socially and environmentally responsible. And the final question I'd just like to pose to the panel, we have 10 minutes left, so about a minute and a half, 2 minutes per person. What can Brandeis students do to push for this type of change that we need to see here, specifically on campus and at this administration or with their professors, just keeping it local. But, there's plenty of people in the room here who want to know, what can I do today, this month, this year, to make this change possible?
I would say don't underestimate the power you have. You are really the most powerful part of the university. And you can change a lot. If 10 students walk into the president's office and demand something, that makes a much bigger splash than if 10 of us sit here and talk for an hour. Believe me, you can ask and you can demand and you can organize. I say start meatless Mondays, push for divestment, organize a climate education group, talk to each other, get moving. Don't be paralyzed by the enormity of the problem.
So in a moment of frustration, I once put out an idea for a book, and then I was forced to do it. And I ended up editing a work called Voices of Protest, Documents of Courage and Dissent, together with two colleagues. And it looks at the importance of protest to democratic societies, going back to Greek and Roman times, around the world, around every single aspect of societal progress, economics, environment, women, men, race, gender, everything. And what was fascinating about that, aside from the fact of how many documents of courage and dissent there were to choose from, is that, like the quote that Eric read about George Bernard Shaw in The Unreasonable Man, every single major act, major step forward, whether we're talking the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the environment movement of the 1970s, you name it, it all, 8-hour workday, it all started with protest. And when that protest began, it was seen as unreasonable. So I would encourage the student body to protest, because it's your future, even more than any of us, because we have less of it to live than you do. I would get out there, I would use your creativity, I would use song, I would use music, I would use dance, I would use art. I don't necessarily mean by protest, fire bombs in the streets or occupying the president's office. There's a lot of alternatives well short of that I think are likely to be more effective.
Nonviolence. Nonviolence.
Exactly. Thank you. Get out there. Speak your minds.
So, one of the things that faculty are very aware, and administration sometimes, I guess, is that students come and they go, and we send them out into the world, and they're just sort of here for a little while. And you may not realize, because you weren't here then, but we were, that as I understand it, recycling happened on this campus only because of students. The first recycling bins only got put out because the students finally said, when administration said, we can't do this, can't do that, okay, we're going to go put them out. Just give us the bins and we'll put them out. So I just wanted to reinforce what's being said about there's so much you can do, and don't underestimate it.
Ditto. I'll go a little outside the box here. I'd say, think of a place that you love, whether it was a place that you went to summer camp as a kid, or that you vacationed at with your family, and imagine that place in 30 years, when you will be in the midst of approaching the end of thinking about what you're going to do with your rest of your life.
You're our age.
Yeah, and you're our age. Put yourself in that spot in your head and imagine having a conversation with yourself at our age about what you did to make the world a better place while you were in college. And just try and imagine having that conversation. And don't make up let yourself tell you what you need to hear.
Just want to sort of reflect a little bit what Judy was saying is that there are a spectrum of activities and actions that you can take. And whether it's being divestment and this group of companies are evil, or reduce your carbon footprint. And so that and what you need to do on campus and across Massachusetts, which, as you know, did not pass the inflation indexing to the gas tax. So just remember that is, as you say, what is the best tactic that will include more people and get support. That would be one of the debates as you have this dialogue. And you also know, as you look at student surveys, climate change does not come out on top. Finding a job comes out on top, and some other things, and figuring out what you want to do. So again, figuring out how you get a group of people on campus saying that this is important, and how do we get a dialogue that people listen to and pay attention to. I'm remembered by a friend of mine who's president of Oxfam in the United States, talked about how Oxfam used to protest the large extracting companies for a long period of time. And they basically found out that that tactic was not working. And so about 15 years ago, they said, how can we engage the extractive mining companies, which are doing a lot of business in Africa, and get into the boardroom to think about how we can come up with, policies which are more friendly to the people working there and to the environment. And so Oxfam went through a long process of evaluating their strategy and tactics, and have changed and have very much engaged in the boardrooms and trying to say we need to be in the boardroom to have those dialogues, to make those changes. And so I think that is one of the things, as you figure out and think about your tactics, you're trying to say what is the best set that will get more people engaged around this conversation.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the gas tax, because I think that reminds us about elections. And so, as you're now mostly over 18, I assume all of you in the room are over 18, you can vote. So please vote as often as possible. Longer term, move to a red state, have lots of kids, and get them to vote when they one of the reasons the gas tax doesn't have any mobility in this country, though, is because 43% of people don't think the scientists know what they're talking about. And so, this comes back again to the sort of befuddled electorate we have in our country and the lack of leadership. That I think, the role of a wise leader should be to get to office, get really smart people to come and advise him or her, and then educate. But we don't see that. That's not the way this is working. So it's pretty discouraging. But vote is one of those things you can do. Become active in the political process. I just want to echo some of the things that were said down the line. I was at a meeting about divestment at Harvard recently, and 4 of the faculty who are on the pro-divestment committee were in the room, and they gave their very cogent, reasonable talks about all this. And finally, this elderly physicist, he was asked, what should we do? And he said, civil disobedience. It just shook the room, So there you go.
Said 3 things, actually, right? You said civil disobedience, uncivil disobedience.
That's right, you were there too.
Yeah.